Recorded live from the mats of Radical MMA in New York City. The Martial Culture Podcast. Your source for in-depth combat sports and martial arts insights with Coach Rene and Matt Peters. Ring the bell and let's get it on.
All right, we're back with another episode of Martial Culture Podcast. We are naming names and lighting fires. Rene is here with me again, and we have another special guest that is going to shine some lights and open some eyes. So let's get to opening.
Sure. This is a special Juneteenth episode, and I think in light of the sort of larger social upheavals that we're seeing right now and social movement, it's really important that we add our voice. And one of the voices that I saw being very active on social media in a really wonderful and progressive way was Dom Hoskins, and it's really wonderful to have you on the podcast. Welcome. Can you tell us a little about yourself?
Happy Juneteenth, and thank you guys for having me on. Where to start? I guess I got into jiu-jitsu in particular in 2006. I've grown up in the Bay Area. For much of that, got my blue belt in Northern California, and then made my way down to Southern California and settled in San Diego, and then got all my other belts through Rodrigo Medeiros, Carlson Gracie black belt, and that was pretty much it. I kind of traveled the world competing and teaching, and then eventually made my way back to the Bay Area, and now I've been settled here for about 2.5, 3 years now. So yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for now.
Well, fantastic. Do you mind if I ask you what got you into martial arts in general? Was it, for me, it was, I grew up in the 70s and mostly the 80s, and it was, a sense of wanting to have personal protection. Was that it, or was it just more athletics, or what got you into martial arts in general?
Honestly, I was a track and football guy, and I had a buddy, close friend of mine, who had been getting bullied in high school, and so he had started taking it up under his uncle, who is a Igor Gracie black belt, and so he invited me. He was just like, "I think you'd be pretty good at this," and I didn't really like the politics of the sports I was doing because, like the higher the levels, the closer to professional, the more it gets political. And so, go figure on us talking right now. But it's like the closer to professional you get, the more political it gets. And so I wasn't enjoying it. So I went and checked it out with him after he had, kind of nagged me for about a year, and I loved it. Turned in my pads within the week that I started and never looked back. And then could see all the, life lessons that you can learn off the mat that you're learning while you're on the mat. So that was pretty much it. Thank you to my friend for getting me into it.
And I know you've been pretty active on the Fight to Win circuit as well, so that's pretty amazing too. And I don't know you personally, but I know that you're a very, very highly regarded black belt with a lot of skills. So it's fantastic to have someone like that on the show. Can I move to your experience? You said you grew up in the Bay Area, and the Bay Area is like kind of generally known as a progressive place. But what was your upbringing, and let's just say your relationship with I don't know, your interaction with, say, law enforcement, or how what was your life as a kid in the Bay Area?
Yeah, the Bay's a melting pot, that's for sure. It's interesting because you would think that with a melting pot and a politically progressive area that you wouldn't necessarily encounter too many negative issues when it comes to, law enforcement or racism, but I've honestly dealt with it all my life. I can preface by saying that since grade school, like I've been in, gifted programs and like the little genius kid programs and overachiever in school. And I've done all that stuff, but I still got primed by my parents by having the quote unquote, the talk probably when I was like 5 or 6 years old, about having to be prepared more so than ready for your day, having to be prepared to encounter either subtle forms or blatant forms of racism. And being an intelligent Black man at that makes me a threat in the eyes of many. So yeah, even given all that, and given the fact I have no actual criminal record, I've had my fair share of issues. One time I went to the church across the street from my house, and, you know, I'm putting money in a vending machine, and a cop drives by. Then the cop turns around and pulls into the parking lot as I'm putting this money in the vending machine, hops out of the car, pulls a gun on me. Now,
and how old were you at the time?
14, probably 13, 14, and pulls the gun on me without saying anything, asking anything, just on sight. Pulls a gun, asks what I'm doing after, and so I was in my head like, well, you're asking the questions after you've already pulled a gun, but you all actually already see what I'm doing. So ask what I'm doing, and I tell them I'm buying snacks for my mom. The guy asks me a couple more questions, runs a check on my name, nothing comes up, and then asks if I'm from around there, if I'm from the area. And I lived in Walnut Creek, which is a pretty affluent area out here. So as you can imagine, I don't look like the general makeup of the population here. And so he runs the check, doesn't find anything, asks if I'm from there. And I go, yes, of course. You know, why would I be at this random church in the middle of Walnut Creek? And he goes, where do you live? And I go, across the street. And then the look on his face is something I'll never forget, because the shock and awe that I could possibly be from the area just kind of threw him off. So he lets me finish grabbing my snacks, and then kind and politely puts his gun away and sits and watches me walk all the way through into my door. So that was one instance. There's been a number of other ones. I think ones that stand out to me, and pardon if I'm going on and on, but there's a lot on my mind. Yeah, there was one instance. So we're in a parking garage, parked in the car, eating, facing a wall, and we finish eating, and I get ready to throw the trash out. So I get ready to get out of the car, and my car door is slammed back shut. And so I start laughing because I just assumed that some friend in the area was just trying to mess with us. So I open the door again, and I'm greeted with a gun in my face. Don't make another move or I'll shoot. And I'm mortified.
And how old were you at the time?
And confused. Probably 18.
And you were in a parking lot for like a mall or something like that, or?
Yeah. It was a movie theater parking lot. We were going to go watch a movie after we ate. And so now I'm sitting here with this guy, unholstered gun, pointed at me, and I'm just like, what is going on? So he asked for my license, registration, runs a check on me. Again, nothing, because I don't have a criminal record. And meanwhile, my buddy, he's a white guy that was sitting in the passenger seat. He's screaming bloody murder at this guy, and he's like, my dad is chief of police in a nearby town, and you'll hear about this, and this is BS, and all this other stuff. And so the officer looks at me and tells me to handle my boy. So not only am I, in this situation that I didn't even need to be in, but then he makes me have to assume responsibility for the white guy talking as opposed to just addressing him directly. And then it goes through the same runaround of, are you from here? Don't look like you're from here. I'm like, my address is literally on my license. You know where I live, but still goes through the runaround. Doesn't find anything on his criminal check. And then before he leaves, my buddy goes, why'd you even mess with us anyway? And so the officer says, because I, as in me, he was like, yeah, because you were mean mugging me. And so I was like, what? A, I did not know that was a criminal offense. And B, how could I possibly be doing that when I'm facing a wall? He yells at me to not talk back and just be thankful, and then gets in his car and goes away. So thank you, Officer Rebello, because I've never forgotten your name. And then what else? Oh, I guess the two most triggering ones are actually more recent than people would realize, with everything that's been going on, like you were mentioning, like the fight to win and all the stuff I've been doing, like with my schools. You would probably be past this stuff now that I'm not a kid, but I actually think the other ones are worse. And one is I got wrongfully accused of something at a party. They basically just described a black man assaulting somebody, which obviously would not be the best idea considering my line of work. So officer walks into this house party situation, zeroes in on me and turns me around and cuffs me face down on a bed. I turned my head because my face was stuck in a pillow. So I turned my head to breathe, and he yells at me to stop resisting. So I tell him, I am not resisting, sir. I was just trying to breathe. So given the events that happened with George Floyd, you can imagine why that event in particular triggered me a bit. And then, long story short,
the George Floyd incident, or was after?
This was before. This was
right.
Probably about a year ago. Yeah. So,
and this was in the Bay Area.
This was in the Bay Area. All of these have been in the Bay Area. And so you can see why that would trigger me for sure. Seeing that video and seeing how those things happened, because that could have literally been me. And like I was saying, all the, any accomplishments I've had, any clubs I've been in, any, the businesses I run, the, college, high school grad, or any of the volunteer work I do, none of it matters at that point. And my political affiliation for damn sure doesn't matter. And there was no media attention when I was going through this. So, that event got me. And then long story short, once again, you don't look like you're from around here. Where are you from? And check my criminal record. It's non-existent. And then I'm left to go on about my merry way. And then they found whoever actually was doing whatever assault that they were talking about. And then the last event was one that actually it almost triggered me more than my similar George Floyd incident. But I was walking down the street at night, and there's this woman standing outside of a bar, and she's bawling her eyes out crying. And so I asked her if she's all right. And long story short, she tells me that she was afraid to go home because she didn't know if her boyfriend would pop out of somewhere or catch her. And I see that she's like bruised and scratched up. And so obviously a domestic violence victim. And so I was like, hey, nothing weird, nothing extra, but I can drive you home. And she was like, I live walking distance. So I was like, okay, then I'll walk you home. Perfectly fine. And I've got another white buddy with me that's kind of straggling behind us. So as I'm walking her home, police officer drives up. She gets out of her car and stops us. And then she asks what's going on. And I try to explain she's a domestic violence victim, because I'm assuming that this woman doesn't really want to talk. So I start trying to explain, like, she's a domestic violence victim. We're just trying to walk her home and make sure she's safe. And the officer screams at me to shut up. Verbatim, shut up. And I further try to explain, and then she starts getting even more irritated and is like, look, do you want to go to jail? Now, I didn't know what crime I had committed by trying to explain I was trying to keep somebody safe, but that's what I'm getting screamed at. So she then starts talking to the woman and is asking her leading questions like, do you know this man? Are you sure you're safe with him? Where exactly was he going to take you? And starts, trying to egg on a conversation. Meanwhile, my buddy starts explaining the conversation. She has absolutely no qualms with listening to him. And he's just nice and politely, yeah, we were just trying to take her home and yada, yada, yada. She's perfectly fine with that. So I repeat his sentiment, and I was like, yes, ma'am, this is what I was trying to express to you. And she yells at me to get on the ground. And then she goes, if you really want to go to jail, you can go to jail. Calls for backup, and the backup is an Asian cop. The Asian cop walks up to me, asks for my ID, runs a check. There's nothing. And so then, and meanwhile, this white lady cop is still, asking leading questions and is just basically in blatant denial that I was doing anything to help. Although the woman is literally saying, this is the first time I've felt safe all day. So I'm on the ground. My buddy's standing up doing just fine and can voice his opinion. And this is all for me trying to help somebody that was feeling defenseless. And so the Asian cop actually, after running the check, goes, you seem pretty chill and mild-mannered. What was the issue? And I was like, I couldn't tell you, but it starts with an R. And then he just looks at her, and then he looks back at me, and then he just shakes his head and apologizes and hops back in his car. And so then once again, she gives me the, you don't look like you're from around here. She has the woman hop into her car, and then she drives her off and then tells me to be careful. Doesn't say anything to the other guy that had been talking the whole time. So those are my experiences. Those are the ones that stick out. But there's
and some of
more.
Many, you're saying. Yeah. And how do you feel when law enforcement enter picture in general? Like, you see a police officer on the street, not necessarily engaging with you, but how does that make you feel as a person in general when you just see a law enforcement officer?
It's a very, very odd feeling because I've always had to have my guard up. As far as law enforcement goes, like even with like all the pro-black stuff that I'm posting and everything that I'm, standing for, I am not anti-cop in the least, and some of my best friends are law enforcement or former law enforcement, but I'd be lying if I told you that I don't get that rush of adrenaline or fear when, law enforcement's near me or cops are behind me when I'm in my car. Because I don't know what if I haven't done anything wrong and I still have those kinds of experiences, then I can't help but feel that way. And so it's like an interesting thing that, you see those memes where it's like red, white, and blue stand for freedom unless they're shining behind you. And also ironic that cop cars are black and white. But yeah, so like I get some fear, some anxiety. It's not so much an anger thing. I'm angry at what I've gone through, but I'm not angry at a certain direction. You know, it's just a more of a frustration that I or anybody else has to even deal with that, you know, and proportionally, you know, black folks are the ones that are having to deal with it more than anybody. And so it's a very maddening and saddening feeling, you know?
Very, very well said. If I can just jump in for 1 second, and have not had these experiences here in America, though when I lived in Japan, I experienced profiling, probably every day, you know? I lived there for 6 years. And it was just like, oh, right, I get it. Because even though I'm Latin, I pass as white and don't, the melanin content of my skin makes it easier for me to go about my day. Whereas my cousins don't have that same luxury and have had some, serious, interactions that could have been life-threatening. But I will say this, I teach a lot of law enforcement officers, and I can count a few law enforcement as very close friends. I'm not anti-cop either. I think reform of the police is actually pro-cop. It's sort of like the same argument, support the troops. Well, if you really support the troops, how about we figure out wars that are meaningful and not, completely meaningless, and so there's not meaningless death, and we look out for soldiers' mental health, and the same thing for officers. How are we putting officers in positions, because the system itself is oriented an apartheid system, and that's really what it is. It's an arm of, it's an appendage of a larger system of oppression. And I think if we rethink law enforcement, it's good. It's pro cop to be reformed. That's my personal opinion. I hope I didn't step on you or step on what you'd like to say.
No, not at all. It's exactly what I think of it as. If there's reform, all we're doing is promoting law enforcement being able to further do their jobs and do them better. Like, the goal is to not end up on the news, Right. The goal is to not have these stories and not have to, see people hurt and crying and things burning and people frustrated. The goal is to not have those things, And so it's 100% pro cop to look to have some sort of reform so that they can better do their jobs and people can, live their lives in a more functional way and not have the fear and angst that I have when I see law enforcement, even when I'm not even doing anything wrong. So I 100% agree with you on that. It's interesting that I think you can look at the data, and I'm a data-oriented guy. And, first of all, crime has decreased significantly over the last 40 years. Let's say 30 years, from 1990 on. And yet, it could be reporting or, obviously improvements in video technology, but the amount of, racially motivated complaints and issues and murders has stayed constant or if not, risen. And I think a good example of this is the post-Columbine massive increase in school policing, which has almost never stopped a school shooting. And yet there's a massive increase in, these minor infractions of, discipline that result in that inordinately amount on the black population that result in, incarceration, juvenile incarceration, or some sort of, instinct with the police. So we put all these police in,
to stop school shootings, but what they did is they just wound up having little minor offensive discipline offenses, not life-threatening, but just discipline offenses against people of color and predominantly African American.
Yep.
So we didn't stop school shootings. School shootings have risen all the time. So their security apparatus is failing, but their oppressive apparatus has been reinforced. And I think you can see that across the spectrum of officers. And officers are not trained to deal with the complex issues of racism that our society has. The other issue is emotionally disturbed persons. I don't know the exact statistic. I have to look it up. But here in New York, when in New York, they did a study on NYPD officers encounter emotionally disturbed persons, particularly emotionally disturbed persons of color. The chance that the encounter is fatal for the emotionally disturbed person is very, very high. And that's not to say that every cop is bad. It's just you're not trained for that situation. So there's a racial dynamic. There's a lack of training as a therapist, as a person who's used to dealing with someone who's emotionally disturbed, and you're not trained for that. So let's have officers in the situations that you're trained for, and also removing them from the racial calculus that informs almost every day-to-day life in America, and not have that oppressive police state and apartheid state that we have right now.
Yeah, I think there's also, and by the way, rest in peace to Miles Hall. He's a kid, actually went to the high school that I went to, who was gunned down by law enforcement last year in Walnut Creek, this affluent white community. And he was an emotionally disturbed person, and just right to your sentiment, they just didn't know how to interact with him. And it was definitely a failure on the system, because his family had already spoken to law enforcement about, hey, sometimes he can get away, sometimes he can go through certain things. Please call us because we know how to handle him. And rather than call an officer or a couple officers, I believe, took it into their own hands. And so now he's gone. So rest in peace to Miles Hall. But it speaks right to your sentiment that, this is like, there needs to be a reform on how to deal with people in these different sectors. And honestly, I don't know necessarily if it's going to be just a police situation. Honestly, my angle is I believe that this is an education thing before anything. As far as police at first, and I'll get into the education thing, but as far as the police go, a lot of it comes down to you can't be having police officers in cities or areas that they're not familiar with. If a person from Walnut Creek is not going to necessarily be inclined to know how to deal with, people from East Oakland, and so that can obviously escalate situations quicker. There's a level of trust that is cast aside when you have those kinds of things. Like, people are always like on alert and have their guard up when they're in an environment that they don't know. And so, if you have an East Oakland born and bred person that ends up being in law enforcement, they're going to have they're more likely to be able to have a better interaction with people on an everyday basis. And so I think that's a huge part of it. As far as emotionally disturbed, that's going to be more of an education thing as well, where you're, doing more psyche valves on people and making sure that they are better prepared and better equipped to be able to deal with people that are going through distress, but aren't necessarily capable of expressing their emotions in what we as society consider proper ways. So I think that's a big deal as far as police. But even beforehand, I think education's huge. I think that, if you create magnet programs where district borders are cut. And then, you're having people from urban areas and inner cities that are now in positions to be able to go to schools in suburban territories, and vice versa. Suburban folks might end up in inner city schools and stuff. Now, all of a sudden, you're kind of leveling a playing field where,
basically, you're talking about busing. You're talking about busing, which 100%. Martin Luther King supported. Yeah, because we've never enacted the ideals of Martin Luther King, who was gunned down as he was talking about economic and social justice. Everybody's like, every white liberal is like, oh, why don't you protest more like Martin Luther King? Except, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated people in America, at that time. He's only since been rehabilitated as something. And he also was a person who said that busing and social justice has to come with educational, it's part and parcel of this civil rights movement is, educational egalitarianism.
Exactly. I don't think it's an accident. I think timing's everything, and giving and granting quote unquote civil rights was an okay thing, because people are like, well, even if you're not legally segregated, we can still treat you like shit, but then as soon as, the real changes start to get preached, I don't think it's an accident that that's when Martin Luther King was killed. And so it's also like a funny thing when people say you should protest like him, you should, speak out like him, but he was killed. So how well did that work out?
The Birmingham bus boycott was very controversial at the time. Like, it's not like, this is totally appropriate, thank you very much. No. And it was controversial among, the white liberal. And there's that famous quote of Martin Luther King is like, I think it's the white liberal that stands in the place of progress a little bit more than, the hood raving Ku Klux Klan guy,
100%. Yeah. I've been saying the same thing to everybody. Like my social media, open forum. Anybody can go on my social media. I've told people with my academies, I've got 3 locations in the Bay Area. Any racist or bigot that wants to come by, come by. I've been telling, and it's exactly that. I'm like, if somebody denies that there's racism, absolutely just doesn't believe it, then that's actually more dangerous to the movement than somebody that's outwardly racist or bigoted, because the outwardly racist and bigoted at least have an opinion. So that's an opportunity to be able to educate and go back and forth and have a dialogue. If you just if you deny it, if I tell you my house is on fire and you say, no, it's not, I can find ways to prove to you that my house is on fire. But if I tell you my house is on fire and you say you don't believe in fire, how am I ever going to convince you of anything? So,
honestly, the fire was the only fault anyway. So, because it's, you didn't take care of the house right. So it's your own fault, and you should actually put it out this way rather than this way. You know what I'm saying?
Well, why? Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, well, either way, we're not solving the problem. If you're just going to debate semantics on how we can solve the problem,
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, let's not debate. Let's just do it.
Yeah. Do you mind if we pivot a little bit away from the law enforcement issue and the larger structural issue and just talk about, I know, because we're running a little bit low on time, but if you want to continue this, it's totally fine. But I know Matt, was interested in asking you about what happened with you and Igor Gracie. And I know that was a big blow up. But the thing is, while it is Igor Gracie did post something, it's not just Igor Gracie, but a huge amount of people in our community. He represents a way of thinking in the martial arts community, and we as martial artists, particularly as instructors of tactical operations, play a huge role in arming police officers with more deadly force to be, more effective at murdering innocent people, possibly. Not always, of course, but it's like as martial art and tactical instructors, this is something that I think we have to look at and just as members of the martial art community to understand that we are not followed. I saw a meme yesterday, and I just reposted it. It said, "Oh, the martial arts mat is the best place because police officers mix with ex-criminals and whites mix with black and, blue mix with brown and blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, that's sometimes true, but it's not always true.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy posting it was Tom DeBlas, a very, very, white guy. So, how much racism did you ask a black guy about what he felt in your, before you posted that? You probably didn't. Now,
Exactly.
Of course, there are academies where that is true, but there's a lot of academies that are very, very white spaces. And, if you don't mind, if you'd like to continue talking about the structural issues, no problem. So let me not tell you what to speak about at all. But I would like to maybe address the community if we can, but it's up to you, of course.
Oh, no, it's fine. Honestly, I feel like we'll probably have to just do this over the course of a few just to, get all the stuff out. But as far as the Igor Gracie thing goes, and it was interesting because it inadvertently created the platform that I've kind of got now, speaking out and educating people on these issues. But with him, I was just scrolling through my Instagram. I mindlessly follow jiu-jitsu people all over, but I see him post something following the George Floyd incident. I have since found that he had copied and pasted it from Mika Kapili. So that was also like an interesting tidbit because it came about that he was just trying to get positive exposure off of the death of a black man.
I'm sorry, he copied and pasted it from who? From what?
From Mika Kapili of in Vegas. He had Mika had posted it as
That's an instructor.
Yes, and he had posted something saying basically all local police chiefs feel free to contact me and I will give seminars and workshops for free to help the law enforcement in the area so that they can better address situations. And so I have since found that Igor just copied and pasted that. And Mika was coming from a good place. Like I've known him for forever. He was coming from a good place. And then once some people, I didn't get the chance to talk to him, but once some people had kind of really shown him what was up and talked to him about the issues, he kind of changed his perspective on it. But with Igor, he posted this. And so I basically told him, I was like, yeah, man, well, the training would be helpful, but no amount of jiu-jitsu is going to untrain the hate out of somebody's heart. And so he basically scoffed and started putting up racist comments about how, black people need to stop complaining and start working more. And, he was tired of hearing the narrative about police brutality against cops and a bunch of different things. And I was like, well, there's no narratives or agendas. This is factual stuff that happens. And I was telling him, yeah, I've gone through it directly, with no media presence or political affiliation being established. So so it's a real thing. And so he then told me that I should, instead of focusing on, I should focus on the future as opposed to dwelling on the suffering of my ancestors. And it was at that point I was like, okay, I'm going to make an example of this guy. I don't normally blast anybody particular. I'll blast an entity if I feel that it's wrong. But in this case, I was like, this is necessary because this guy, his name has a following. His family name has a following. And, people, and he's got a large platform. And so if he's spewing this stuff, he's poisoning the community, the jiu-jitsu community for one, but even outside of that, people that don't know jiu-jitsu know the Gracie name, And so I was like, this has to be addressed. So I made a post and I talked about, hey, I know we have this hierarchical, view in jiu-jitsu. But don't hero worship black belts like that. This guy's trying to make $1 and get some exposure off a legitimate death of somebody. And there's people that are dying and struggling, and he's making fun of it. So it was like a good lesson to let people know, on one hand, what happened to George Floyd was a people issue, not a political issue, not a training issue, because jiu-jitsu would only make bad cops worse and good cops better at their jobs. But that was a people issue, and we have to untrain hate, but also don't worship these guys. And so since then, it kind of sparked a lot of people where they started kind of looking at their own schools. Like, if Dom can go after Igor, what's going on, in my dojo? What's going on in my gym? Like, who are the people that I follow? What do they really believe? And so it's kind of opened up a lot of conversation. There's a lot of people that are getting educated, but then there's a lot of people that are also, seeing divides. I've got people calling me like, hey, I'm finding out that my teacher's racist. I think I want to, migrate over to your school, or I want to leave schools, or, there's a lot of different perspectives being thrown out now as a result of, the conversation that was started. And then since I made the post and kind of basically exposed Igor, he decided to create his echo chamber. So he made his page private, and he started, trying to like badmouth like my technique videos and some other stuff, like basically immature stuff, instead of having like a legitimate discussion, which further told me that what he knows is what he's spewing is wrong. Because if he really thought it was right, he wouldn't have to go into all these measures of hiding. And so it's basically been the same pattern for many different people that I've encountered.
Yeah, I actually also know that you have the screenshots of what he did when he tried to erase it, and I would also say that the ones that I read, you actually toned down what he actually said, and so I think you're even trying to be a little bit respectful, even though he obviously was completely out of line, and he's just he is ignorant of racial politics, and to me he represents one of those people like the I don't see color people. And yes. It's great. You don't see color. That's great. Okay, fantastic. I think you probably do, but you don't realize it. But even so, our society, the way everything works, everything here is oriented in a way that disadvantageously affects people of color. And you not choosing to see that is an act, is a political act. You are part and parcel. It's sort of like, I would say it's like the Matrix, when Neo goes into the Matrix and the guy and Morpheus is educating, he's like, okay, there's Agent Smith. Now there's all these other innocent people, but they're part of the Matrix. They're part of the system. And Agent Smith is the enemy, but the system is really the enemy. And so anybody in the Matrix can instantly become is a part and parcel of the problem. And obviously, that's the mood. It's not that's not by chance, because obviously, Matrix is talking about racism in that movie, but that's really an educating perceptive. We're in this matrix of an oppressive system, and you could have a good cop, you could have a bad cop. When they're put in a system, they're part of lowercase r racism. But in the case of George Floyd, it doesn't even matter about the training, because there was a capital R racist, in that situation, and gratuitously used, his whatever training he had to murder a person. And the issue is not training. The issue is, how do we change the system and to hold people accountable. And that's, to me, in New York, we've had chokeholds were not part of normative police operating procedure since 1983. We've had 3 high-profile, I can't really call them chokeholds because they're technical term is carotid or tracheal restraint. We've had 3 high-profile carotid and tracheal restraint deaths, murders, and no accountability. We've also had, policemen. I remember the case Abner Lima, where a policeman used a nightstick to brutally sodomize Abner Lima for hours. That's not part of operating procedure. That certainly isn't. Another one used a taser to genitally shock a suspect in custody brutally. That's not a part of operating procedure. So obviously you have these bad apples, number one, but there's the other thing is this other side of the system that there's no accountability. That most of these people got scot-free. Eric, the person who choked to death, Eric Garner, Pantaleo, is free today. And that's a fact. And it's a larger system. Let me shut up. I'm sorry. I don't want to speak over you. I'm just also passionate about this as well.
It's perfectly fine. Yeah. I mean,
I spoke out
there. Diallo getting shot 47 times for pulling out his wallet. It's also not part of operating procedure either.
Sean Bell.
This is a very 100%. Like this is, and the list goes on and on and on. And, and me just in the beginning of our talk, just talking about my instances, I'm like, if I didn't take those times as seriously as I did, I could be one of those names. Literally, pardon me. But I could absolutely be one of those names. And so, that's why this stuff means so much, because I'm one of the quote unquote privileged Black people, just to be able to, live quote unquote as freely as possible. But, being able to have the opportunities that I've had to be able to, travel the world, to, work a job that I actually want to work and, graduate school and all this. So it's not just advocating for people like me, it's advocating for everybody. And that's also part of, the message I'm trying to let people know is don't root for this movement because you're rooting for people like me, don't root for the privileged ones. It's everybody. This isn't just you get to pick and choose which Black people that you root for. You're rooting for everybody. And it's an interesting thing. There's like a logical fallacy when it comes to either or. It's like, if you're not with us, you're against us. And which is normally a true fallacy that, just because I'm not with something doesn't mean that I'm automatically against it. But with this, the system inherently works against Black people every single day. So if you are stagnant, if you are neutral, if you don't do anything to help it, if you are not anti-racist, you are rooting for the system. If you are literally not with Black people on this movement, you are against it. So it's a very interesting, movement to be going through and to be, trying to educate people on.
How do you feel? How have you felt in martial art circles in general? Have you had in the jiu-jitsu circle? Have you had experiences where you felt like you were in a very white space or very othered, or have you had experiences like that in the jiu-jitsu world prior to the George Floyd murder?
Before it was interesting. Like every so often I'd have them. I've noticed. If you think about it, you've been in the game since 2000. I've been in since 2006. How many prominent Black jiu-jitsu players have major sponsorship deals? I'll wait.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, I have no idea.
Tim Spriggs, brilliant, right? Like Tim Spriggs, brilliant, awesome player. Jamil Hill, brilliant, awesome player. DJ Jackson, brilliant. Me, I've done more fight to win fights than almost anybody in history. Cool. Where are all the sponsorships going? They don't go to us. And so it's a very interesting thing that a place like Brazil, where this stuff was derived, obviously from Japan before, but a place like Brazil that goes through so much racism and racial politics and issues, you know, it ends up getting carried where Black folks are still looked down upon, you know, down there, the Black Brazilians, and then bring this art to the U.S. and it's the same thing. Like the white folks and the Brazilians kind of have like a hand in hand, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of good old boys club.
I want to interrupt here and just 1 second. I'm sorry, but you know,
sure.
I have a lot of respect for the Gracie family, and the Gracie family is a very large family that politically matches all the different aspects of the spectrum. So I don't want to say all Gracies are this or that, but the fact of the matter, the significant portion of the Gracie family, not all, because like I said, it's a big family, but a significant portion throughout the history of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu has been aligned themselves with the larger power structure of the Brazil and put themselves as an elitist martial art. And that is a criticism that was leveled at Elio. And he never, you know, was like, that's no problem. You know, he was the teacher of politicians. He was the teacher of people on Ipanema Beach, Copacabana Beach.
The
and
elites,
he was
had money,
not the guy who went into the favelas, you know. In the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people who went into the favelas was actually non-Gracie lineage, or obviously other martial arts like capoeira. But that was never, you know, if you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, you have to understand that it did have an elitist streak that aligned itself with the larger systemic power structures of Brazil, which of course are white. And you know, it's some of the battles of luta livre versus, you know, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, you know, you can just see it's black versus white very often. Not always, but very, very often. Zulu was black, Hickson's white. You know, well, part white, obviously they're not 100% white, but, you know, they align themselves with that power structure, and they do the same thing very often. The Gracies do the same thing here. But again, not everybody in the family, but just and I know you're familiar with Clark Gracie and some of the other people who, you know, are very different side of the family. So let's not say every Gracie, but there's certain voices of the Gracie family. You can see that, I mean, Hoist Gracie makes no secret that he's a very strong Trump supporter. So there's that, you know. So I completely agree with what you're saying in that, you know, our art has an orientation from the very beginning of aligning itself to power structures.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to behold. I was actually going to mention Clark because, you know, he got his black belt under Rodrigo as well, and he was like my big brother on the team, blonde and white as they come. And I don't even know his political beliefs. He just treated me like a brother. So yeah, that definitely goes to show that, you know, it's not all the way across the board, but it's definitely prevalent. You can definitely see it, and I'm thankful for my upbringing. I had, you know, Carlson Gracie gives Rodrigo his black belt, but Carlson was also one of those people that was, you know, teaching those guys in the favelas and then creating a team of people that everybody should have jiu-jitsu, not just the rich, you know, and that, you know, drove the stake between his relationship with some of the family members. And so he paid that forward to the people that he taught. And then, you know, Rodrigo paid it forward to me when I was too broken poor to even do jiu-jitsu. Rodrigo found my job, walked in, and told me to come to the gym. So that's actually like a fun little sidebar. But it's cool in retrospect to think that he was just paying that exactly forward. But yeah, it's that good old boy network is absolutely prevalent, you know, assuming the worst about the black folks and, oh, you're only good because you're strong. Like, isn't this art supposed to be about the smallest guy being better than the biggest, like being able to beat the biggest? Like, so being strong wouldn't mean anything, whether I was or not, but, oh, you're only good because you're strong. Assuming the worst, not being offered sponsorships because you're not the image that we want, or you're not fitting, or, you've fit all the criteria and checked off all the boxes, but we still just don't want to do it. That the list goes on and on and on and on. And so like, I haven't, like, the environment that Rodrigo, or should I say Master Rodrigo at this point, because he just got a 6th degree, but that he cultivated at his gym was always inclusive. The Gracies that I know are all stand-up people, but then there's also the Igors of the world, that do a very good job at trying to tarnish the name, whether intentional or not. And so I think somebody sent me something that I guess Kivia has been outwardly speaking similar sentiments to Igor now. So add her to the list. But yeah, like, I haven't felt like I was like on the outside, really like in like a blatant type of way, but I definitely have felt those undertones, like I said, between sponsorships. There was like one time I know I medaled at the World Championships, and somebody, I don't know if it was Gracie Mag or who it was, somebody came up with a camera and a microphone to interview me. And so they immediately, at the time I didn't know any Portuguese, and so they immediately start rambling in Portuguese to ask me a question. And I go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak Portuguese." And they go, "Oh," and look at me disgusted. And then they just walk off to the next person, some guy that hadn't even placed at the tournament. And then they go off and just go talking to him. And I'm just like, it's just those little subtleties that I pay attention to. And, you start coming up with all the people that say they don't see color, and they tell you, you're just looking for it. You paint with a racial colored brush and all this other stuff. And I'm like, no, I just notice these things because this is the life I have to live, So in jiu-jitsu, it hasn't been horrible, but I definitely have seen it from time to time.
It's funny that I didn't want to talk about this, and I've actually been out of the competitive jiu-jitsu world for a long time because I really focus on MMA. And I technically I disagree with a lot of what's going on in the sports jiu-jitsu world, but hey. But one thing I noticed is there's a hierarchy of like, and we've been in martial art world for a long time. I started martial arts in 1975, so you can see this kind of weird thing that there's a hierarchy of respect. And first there's like, okay, the founder of the Gracies. Then, okay, if you're Brazilian black, you get kind of a pass, but not if you're American black.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think that might have been what you experienced right there. It's like, okay, if you're black but Brazilian, that's okay. But if you're black but you're American, that's not as good.
It's wild, man.
Yeah. It's like this weird hierarchy of respect.
It's funny. Like, I've actually, I mean, it's sad, but it's not, but I say it's funny. I've had my coaches, literally, I'll have my white coach Cowboy and my Brazilian coach Rodrigo, and they're telling me, you know what? Like, once I started learning some Portuguese, they were like, "We're just going to coach you in Portuguese because you're more likely to get the nod if they think you're a black Brazilian than if they think you're a black American." And lo and behold, I won a fair share of fights. I won't tell those opponents who they were, but I won a fair share of some close fights where I have all faith it was because they thought I was a black Brazilian. And, and to like a larger level, it's crazy because I've been telling people, I'm like, black Americans have to be the most poorly marketed people on this planet. If we go anywhere, we get looked down upon, there, and obviously it's not everybody, like, cause somebody's going to always take something out of context, but you can go to, I lived in Asia for a short period. When I lived there, I bumped into somebody. They start, rambling off at me. It was very interesting. They start yelling at me in Cantonese. And so, I go, "Oh, I'm sorry." And they go, "Oh, English, you're American?" And I go, "Yeah." And they're like, "Oh, okay, it's fine." And so I
get
was
a pass,
like,
right?
Even class, yeah, you get a pass because you're not African, But then even still, I'm like, but if I was African, then what? Like, then you just ramble and cuss at me and say all these slurs. You can go anywhere in the world they're looking down on you. If We're in our own country. You know, you've got people that are following us through stores. And, you know, I was posting about in April. So we're talking a month before the George Floyd thing. And I'm posting about my neighbor who's taking pictures of my license plate and saying I don't look like I'm from here, and confronting me every time I'm there. And so I'm like, but you may not necessarily be here legally. Can you imagine somebody walking into your house and thinking you're going to steal from them? That's how it feels. So the marketing for Black people, like, I really don't get it. You know, in some places we're just objectified and fetishized. So it's, oh, okay, I want to get back at my, you know, white spouse or white counterpart. So I'm going to hook up with a Black guy or a Black woman just to spite them. You know, it's not about us. Yeah. You know, we're just this pawn in everybody's game, and it's insane to see.
You know, it's you touched on something. You know, race is such a complicated and sensitive issue, and it's not like good, bad. And I had a discussion with someone who said something recently, and it was very Manichaean, very white. You know, there's no gray, white, black. I'm not talking race, but I mean like white, black. This is good. This is bad, right? And it's a silly way of looking at problems. Problems are not like that. And the racial issue, of course, is not a simple, you know, binary. It's very complex, and I'll tell you, you know, the race relations, like living in Asia, is very interesting because you want to talk about who looked down on Black Americans a lot. It was actually African Blacks. So I remember a huge street fight in the middle of Tokyo, whereas a bunch of African people from Africa were very aggressive towards African Americans, and it's like, you know, we internalize these hatred, and it doesn't matter what skin color you had. And I remember I had an instructor. I wasn't personally in his class, but it was part of the school that I went to. I won't say which one, but there was an instructor. He was a person of color, but he had internalized so much self-hatred and racism that if you were an African American in his class, you would never ever get a fair shake. But he could also, this is of course, you know, 30 years ago, he's 40 years almost, you know, he could shake off that perception of racism because he was a person of color. But it's not true. He, you know, internalized racism is a very real thing. And discussion of like, oh, you know, you're a racist because you wear a white hood, and you're not a racist because you don't say the N-word is really silly. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. And you can, in your heart, not have any animosity for a person of color, but still be part and parcel of a structure or internalize values that are part of a structure. Yeah, internalize values that diminish other people, even unconsciously. And I think you can see that, like, I met so many people in the martial world who are not capital R racist by any means. They're good, try to be good people, but they've internalized a framework of thinking that diminishes and what's the word I'm looking for? Oppresses, you know, people of color. You know, it's a way of thinking, way of orienting, and an orientation to kind of the status quo. And the status quo is just not egalitarian in any way. So that's kind of how I see it. And again, let me shut up and let you have the floor. I think we have a few more minutes. Matt, do you have anything to add?
I'm just absorbing everything. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you guys. Yeah, I 100% agree with you though. Like there's not a lot of either ors in this, because, you know, there's so much nuance, but that's, you know, the whole basis of, oh, well, everything's equal now. Legally, yes, but there's still an issue of Black people having to play catch up. There's, you know, you got to think that, you know, Civil Rights Act only 55 years old. So, but what about those other 350-ish years that Black people have been here and have been not considered fully human legally? You know, if you've got 400 meters on a track, and then if you let everybody else run 345 meters, and then all of a sudden you say, all right, ready, go. And black people have to start from the very beginning. You know, we're going to have to do a lot more work to get the same outcomes. You know, we're playing a lot of catch up, and then people don't absorb the fact that that head start is there. You know, we have to do more for the same, and it's going to take a while. It's a process to get to where we're at. But I like that people are having these conversations now, particularly in jiu-jitsu world. I'm loving that, you know, it like me not really going after Igor. It's more of a system coming after me, and he's just perpetuating it. But I actually am grateful that I spoke up, because all of a sudden people are looking at their schools and they're looking at other leaders. They're questioning what, you know, these prominent names really represent. You know, for me with Igor Gracie, you know, people that don't know jiu-jitsu know the Gracie name. So even then it woke people up, like, Gracie as in jiu-jitsu? Like, you actually called him out? And I'm like, hell yes. And I think, I was telling you guys earlier, I was like, yeah, I don't, you know, racism and racists have never protected me. So why would I protect them? You know, if anything, I'm just going to try to educate. But now, you know, I'm very intrigued. I'd be very interested to see how gyms start shaking up, who switches teams, who goes to, you know, different schools. I know I've gotten an influx of all these different people that are, hey, we want to have our kids training under you. We want to train under you directly. We appreciate your stance and you standing up for what you believe in. We want to be part of yours. So I can only imagine what it's like all across the board. And I'm very curious to see if anybody else may or may not, you know, it's not about just sitting and trying to exploit every person that's racist, but it's about trying to educate people. Like I was saying, like, don't hero worship these people, because a black belt isn't automatically going to make you a good person, you know?
Yeah. And I just want to go back to the martial art point you made of martial arts, that, you know, black people have to go further. But in the martial arts world, there's so many amazing black martial artists, but we don't know who they are. In New York, there was the Fighting Black Kings, led by William Oliver, Willie Williams. And these guys went to Japan, and they beat the Japanese in the toughest karate tournament in that, you know, probably has ever existed. And I know people who live, you know, in the community where they're from and don't know who these people are. And first of all, like, if you talk about karate heroes, you know, Willie Williams is more celebrated in Japan. I went to Japan, lived there for many years. There was a huge poster of Willie Williams, because he was a hero, because he was someone who adopted and excelled at karate, and they respected that. And that's one thing about the karate world, is that, you know, there's a lot of respect for you know, devoting yourself to the path. But they respected him here, but nobody celebrates him here. Or Ernesto Hoost is a Dutch black Muay Thai fighter, but he's basically kind of forgotten now, you know, and he was Mr. Perfect, you know, how many times K1 champion, and there's a diminishment of black athletes across the board, and in many martial arts. And that's not to say that there aren't celebrations of martial artists in the black martial arts in the community, but open up any copy of Black Belt magazine. How many people teaching there are people of color? Especially, let's narrow down to Black Americans. Open up the copy of Black Belt magazine, and how many Black people do you see? I don't have a subscription to Black Belt anymore, specifically for that reason. It was usually zero, or like in a year, it was maybe 1 or 2 pages, just basic tokenism, so they wouldn't be called out on their racism. You know, so, you know, it's you know, you're talking about the jiu-jitsu community, and I, of course, because you're in the jiu-jitsu community, but I've been in a martial art community in many different styles a lot of times. And Teddy Reiner, one of the most dominant champions of judo, he's Black French. I don't see any highlight videos of Teddy Reiner as much as I see highlight videos of people of less melanin content in their skin.
Stevens or anybody else. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, And Teddy Reiner
it's the same thing
dodged that all his life. That he's just big and strong. Well, you could say the same thing about Shinohara in Japan. Like the guy's a strong guy.
100%.
They just diminish their achievements over and over again. And it's there. There was a sumo wrestler who was very, very dark skinned, and I forgot his name. He never made it to the big leagues.
You're talking about Manny Yarbrough?
No. Manny Yarbrough was in the UFC, but there was a sumo wrestler who really tried to go to Japan and things like that. He actually lived in Japan. But but Manny Yarbrough was another one you might go. I don't know his story that well. I know he passed away, but I know that he encountered problems because he wasn't the right skin tone. In sumo, obviously there's a lot of other issues there that go on the history of Japanese sumo as a religious pursuit, but anyway, it's still it crosses a board of so many martial arts that we diminish the achievement of African American martial artists and African martial artists in general. We look at martial arts Africa has a tremendous martial arts history. When you look at Dambe or all these other martial arts, and yet how much coverage these they don't reach the pantheon of respect. We respect Kung Fu, we respect karate, we respect Taekwondo, but nobody says, I respect Dambe. And only recently have we come to respect Capoeira. And Dr. Chambers, who we're having on soon in another podcast episode, he studied Capoeira. He said that in some Capoeira schools, there's a whitening of Capoeira. It's sort of like, doing yoga without the Indian aspect. They do Capoeira without the linkage to the black aspect, and an attachment to black culture is just something that we don't respect, and that is something that is not capital R racism, but it's lowercase racism that we all have. We all have it, where it's there's this hierarchy of values, and white straight males are literature, and Tony Morrison is not. I was just talking to a friend of mine, and he's a writer and this, and I'm we're talking about Grapes of Wrath and all these, and I'm have you read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which is to me one of the most important novels of the American experience? And he's no, I haven't. And I'm oh, you've read all this other stuff, but you're not reading Ralph Ellison. You're not reading James Baldwin. You're not reading Toni Morrison. You're not a capital R racist. You're just reflecting the society's general disdain for the black experience.
But you're right. It's based, people love the black culture. They just don't love the black people. And it's funny how that works. And, and when they're blurred together, then they just cast you off. It's interesting. We're talking about martial arts and, the reverence, or lack thereof for black martial artists. But then I also think about, in particular in jiu-jitsu world, Lloyd Irvin and his team, and how much he was specifically building up so many, and still does, but is building up so many black athletes. And when the scandal and all this stuff started coming out from his school, it was almost like people were excited, not to downplay anything that happened or is alleged or any of that, but it was almost like people were excited to jump on them. Finally, we got something on them,
Yeah. That's a complex issue, but I will say that the perpetrators were of many different colors, but definitely. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And they were proven innocent, but that's a very complex issue. But I know what you're saying, and the a little bit of we finally got him. I can attest to that.
Exactly. We were kind of, I'm like I said, it's very complex because of the intricacies of what was actually going on. But the response is more so where my focus was at, because I know of, and many of us know of a lot of different things that a lot of different instructors have done as bad, worse,
Worse.
how do you really rate
worse.
that stuff? It's complex, you know?
Yeah, no, right.
But then,
but I mean, like, in terms
how
of
celebrated was it in?
Right. Yeah. Oh, and they get a pass.
Yeah.
Like, oh, Brazilians. I remember one where a Brazilian instructor, guilty, and multiple times, and they're like, in the community, is like, oh, Brazilians will be Brazilians. And not to downplay whatever happened in the loitering scandal, because I'm actually very vocal about that. It was a very terrible situation. But the thing is, what we're highlighting is the difference of response. When it's, a Brazilian dude, it's like, oh, Brazilians will be Brazilians, whatever. And I remember one of my instructors laughing about it. He's like, man, it's just different in Brazil, And I'm like, dude,
yeah,
molesting a minor.
No, you can't do that.
A minor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
and
exactly. Like, it was a Brazilian guy out here that was in the valley, and he had molested like 3 of the child students, and I'm like, that is the worst of the worst. Even if you're in prison, they look down on you, and somehow everybody's celebrating that loiter down with Lloyd and all this other stuff. But then with him, it's just like, oh man, she was probably hot, or Brazilian.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Brazilians.
Right. Yeah,
and I'm like, what is all this stuff?
She's 17, almost an adult. Like, fuck you, man. That's terrible.
No,
and it's not. Yeah, we're not saying either case is correct. What I want to highlight is the difference in attitudes in our larger community. But again, racism and intersects with sexism, and these issues are very complex. And we're touching on another issue, which is the misogyny in our community, and that's another issue too. It's, like I said, it's not like, oh, we can talk about one issue and it can be some easy thing that we solve with some simple change. This is a very complex issues. And if there's one thing I would like our listeners to do is take home and do a self-diagnostic, reevaluate how you think about the world. And if you are, against Black Lives Matter and you're for all lives matter, why is that? What are you thinking? Why are you not actively anti-racist? Right? Why is it that, when a big white guy walks into the elevator, you're okay, but when a big black guy walks in, you clutch your purse.
Yes.
Why what are these attitudes? Where do they come from? You may not be a capital R racist, but we're all, myself included, part of this matrix that has been created that is an oppressive framework. And the only thing we can do is to reevaluate who we are. And like you said, it's education. But anyway, do you have any closing thoughts you wanna finish with? And it was an honor to have you on, my friend.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. I would say, I know I've already spoken at 2 or 3 different protests that have gone on in the area. And I basically told everybody, once you've gotten some of this education, like you're hearing any of like this podcast, or you're going to any of these demonstrations, you're on assignment now, because you can't unhear this stuff. You can't unlearn this stuff. So you're on assignment to educate others. That's the only way that this stuff is going to work. That's the only way that we're going to actually make any kind of change or progress. So that's the first thing. I'd also say that we have to really, really dive deep into that self-evaluation. Anybody non-Black, this is the time to listen to your Black friends. Don't deflect. Don't interrupt. Don't defend anything. Don't try to counter anything. Just listen. And then, for the sake of self-evaluation, evaluate how their turmoil or their experiences are making you feel. And if they're making you feel anything, and then evaluate that some more. You have to really dive deep into how you're actually internalizing or absorbing your friends' experiences and other people's experiences, the movement as a whole, and why or why not help it, helping the movement. That's been a major, major part for me in educating people, is to make sure that they're really like looking deep into themselves. Like, what do you fear you'll lose if Black people are treated equally? you know? And nobody's been able to answer that question, but I'm pretty positive everybody knows their own answers. So that's one thing I would really say to take home is make sure that you're listening to your Black friends and make sure you're really evaluating, how they're feeling and how it's making you feel, and then educate. I think that's about it.
Thank you so much. I think this is a perfect podcast for Juneteenth, and I hope some people who are not actively, engage in this, and we'll kind of listen and give what you say a chance, because the whole idea is to reach people who maybe don't agree with us. But thank you for your time today, and I really hope that also we get to meet each other in person and train. Anytime you're in New York, I would love to have you come by my academy, assuming all this COVID stuff is over.
Absolutely. I know the COVID stuff kind of like tripped everything out, but I normally am out there 2 or 3 times a year. So I'll definitely make the stop by. And then we'll get some rolls in.
Dom, how do people find you and connect if they want to engage with you on like social media?
Social media, Domination's my handle. So Instagram, or Facebook, you can go to DOMINAT 10. 10's my lucky number. So Domination, 10 instead of the IO. And that it's the same for Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, everything. Or you can email me at Domination, 10 instead of IO, MA for martialarts.com. Appreciate you guys.
That's actually pretty cool, the Domination, but the 10. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, the 10's always been about like the pursuit of perfection that we'll never reach. So I threw it in there and it kind of worked.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for your time today, and I hope people can find this useful. Take care, my friend.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys having me on. Happy Juneteenth, y'all.
Thanks for listening. Follow us on Twitter at Martial_Culture and on Instagram at MartialCultureCast. Please leave a review on iTunes, and we'll see you next time on the Martial Culture Podcast.